Okay, so as we've discussed in past weeks, especially in the last couple of weeks, Europe has undergone some transformation. With the disintegration of the Roman Empire, we've seen the splintering of these areas into smaller and smaller political units. And so we're going to see the rise of kingdoms. And this is a pretty significant development. But keep in mind as well that the Roman idea of heritage, this idea of a Roman heritage, continues to be important in these societies, and we're still going to see rulers legitimizing power based on their relationship with Rome, or even in opposition to Rome at times. So we're going to see struggles between the church in Rome, and we're going to see struggles between the church in Rome and with these different political units, with these different kingdoms. So it's very much a complex situation that we're seeing in these few hundred years. But we are starting to see, we will see in our discussion of this time period, that these political units are going to begin to look more and more like the countries that we are accustomed to today. Okay, so let's start with Byzantium. Now, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus was an upstart from a Dynatoi family. He rose to become emperor during rather difficult times. He was able to kind of exploit the situation that the Byzantine Empire found itself in and come to power. And some of these pressures that were being exerted on Byzantium at the time occurred in the form of attacks from other groups. So we have Byzantium under attack from Normans in Italy, Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor, as well as new groups from the Balkans. Alexius was able to avoid defeat by turning his enemies against one another, so he was able to kind of exploit their hatred of one another and turn them against one another and use that to his own benefit. So to fight his wars, Alexius relied on mercenaries as well as allied Dynatoi families. Remember, he's from this part of society, and so he was able to form some alliances with these different families and then use mercenaries to fight his wars. And these Dynatoi families were armed and mounted like European knights, and they were accompanied by their own troops. So this gave Alexius access to a lot of resources. In exchange, he paid the aristocracy with land, and he gave the urban elite offices. He also worked closely with the church, with the Eastern Church. This arrangement made the empire stronger militarily, but it's interesting because even though Alexius Comnenus was so efficient at forming these alliances and turning his enemies against one another, his methods for doing so actually weakened the emperor's individual power relative to the nobility. Okay, so moving over kind of to the other side of the Western world of this time, let's go over to England and talk about what's going on in England at this time. Now, if you'll recall, England up until the 11th century that we're going to start with was under the control of Anglo-Saxons. Now, when the Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, who reigned between 1042 and 1066, died childless, there were actually 3 claimants to the English throne, and these included Harold, who was the Earl of Wessex, Harold, who was the King of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. So we have 3 different claimants to the throne. William, in particular, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne, but Edward's nomination on his deathbed of Harold, who was the Earl of Wessex, was confirmed by the Royal Advisory Committee. So we can see that there is a dangerous situation that is being set up here. Harold was actually crowned, and after he was crowned, William actually invaded England with the Pope's support. So you can see that the church is getting involved in English politics. Harold, the Earl of Wessex, also had to contend with Harold, the King of Norway, and he defeated him. Following his defeat of the King of Norway, he marched 250 miles with his army to meet William. They fought the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066. This is an important battle in the history of England. William's archers helped him to kill Harold and defeat his army. William's subjugation of England actually involved an attempt to replace instead of assimilate the Anglo-Saxon nobility. As much as 1 in 5 English people died in the conquest and its immediate aftermath. And if you're familiar at all with the stories of Robin Hood, a lot of these stories that have come down to us today and that we're most familiar with are set in this time period. And so it would, if you're interested in this, you can kind of go take a look at some of those stories and understand maybe some of the historical backdrop to these stories and why they resonated so much with Anglo-Saxons. The Normans retained many Anglo-Saxon institutions and procedures nevertheless, such as writs to communicate the king's orders, and that is writ, W-R-I-T. And they also used administrative divisions, which included shires. So you're probably familiar with the shires of England. These would be the equivalent of our counties, perhaps, is the way to think of it. But William treated England as conquered booty. He kept 20% of the land for himself and divided the rest as scattered fiefdoms to family members, barons, and others who in turn distributed it to their vassals. All of these people owed the king dues and military service. And so we've already seen that England has a rather centralized government, and that is continuing to be the trend, and that centralization is going to become tighter and tighter as a result of some of these developments. Now, in 1086, William ordered a survey and census called the Domesday, which included an extensive inventory of England's land, livestock, taxes, and population. Domesday continues today to be an important source of information about this time period for historians. Working from Anglo-Saxon tax lists and with local jurors, detailed inquests provided a complete picture of England's resources. Like I said, we know a lot about England from this time period because of Domesday. The Norman conquest connected England closely to the continent's languages, its culture, politics, and institution. Again, it's becoming increasingly centralized and increasingly linked. English wool was widely traded on the continent, and the barons of England kept their estates in Normandy, while England's Norman monarchs spent long periods on the continent. And so for some English people, for some of these people who came from Anglo-Saxons, this is going to be a source of resentment. Okay, so this is just a quick little map that gives you a visual of the Battle of Hastings and where Harold was coming from, where William was coming from. It's just kind of interesting. Okay, this is a famous tapestry, and I want you to take a look at it. It is a tapestry that is told from William the Conqueror's point of view. And when I say it's told from William the Conqueror's point of view, what I want you to do is take a look at it and see if you can decide why you think it's from his point of view. Okay, so something that you might think about is that, William's knights largely fought on horseback, while the English soldiers were largely on foot. So one of the indications that this is being shown, this is this is coming from William's point of view, is that there are indications from this tapestry that these horsemen are superior to the foot soldiers that you can see towards the right. They seem more dynamic. Now, why would both French and English people claim to have made this tapestry? So for the English, even though it depicts a major loss in the battle, it suggests that English craftswomen were still superior. The French might argue that it is part of a romantic story between William and his wife Matilda. It also contributes to the idea of French superiority as they won the battle, claimed to have created the tapestry and displayed it in France. So we have differences in who's claiming this tapestry and what it might mean. And it very much depends on who actually made it, but we don't know that for sure. So across the channel to the old Frankish kingdoms, we have France. The less powerful French monarchy also took part in a revival during the reign of Louis VI, who was otherwise known as Louis the Fat. He reigned from 1108 to 1137. He was supported by an able propagandist, Suger. And Suger might sound familiar to you. If you'll recall, Suger was involved in the development of Gothic architecture. He was the abbot of Saint Denis, and Suger was a supporter of Louis VI. Now Louis was promoted as another Charlemagne, so you can see that would have been pretty significant. He was promoted as a ruler for all society and a protector of the church. As his biographer, Suger promoted Louis as an ally of the Pope and a pious and active defender of the faith. Louis made the most of the king's right to call upon his vassals to aid him in times of war and to collect many dues and taxes, while also drawing revenues from the thriving commercial city of Paris. Royal officials called provosts enforced his royal laws and collected taxes. Louis used the money and land that he collected to dispense favors and gifts and build up his own prestige and power. After Louis's death in 1137, the groundwork had been laid for the gradual extension of royal power in France, with the monarch a powerful warlord, landlord, and in control of the thriving city of Paris. But that's going to take some time because for a number of centuries we're going to see that the French monarch, is a rather weak monarch who very much depends on the support of nobles to accomplish anything. Now, we have the German monarchy as well. It is also experiencing a revival and is experiencing a strengthening of its own power. Henry IV was emperor and king of both Germany and Italy, but he lost much of his power over the church in Italy that his father had wielded. The investiture conflict prevented him from regaining it, and we will talk more about the investiture conflict in the lecture about the church that we have in this same unit. But he could no longer control the church hierarchy, and he couldn't depend on bishops to work as government officials. So in Germany, this was fairly common for bishops to have administrative functions within the government, and Henry really lost the ability to depend on these bishops. Rebellion from the German princes and the growing independence of the Italian states further weakened his authority. His son Henry V, who reigned from 1105 to 1125, faced even more challenges following the investiture conflict, as well as its resolution in 1122 with the Diet of Worms. That settlement invested the monarchy with considerable power in relation to the church, but it didn't strengthen the emperor's relationship to the German princes or to the Italian city-states. And this is going to be a problem for quite some time. In fact, it's going to rear its head during the Protestant Reformation. When Henry V died in 1025, he was actually childless, and the great bishops and princes met to elect a new emperor. That emperor was Lothar III. He was selected from among many candidates, in part because he was not the preferred candidate of Henry V. So that's interesting that he was chosen for that reason. Lothar III also died childless, and following his death, Conrad III was elected. Imperial power remained largely weak until Conrad's nephew, Frederick Barbarossa, strengthened it. And so, just to give you an idea of what Europe is starting to look like, this is a great map for that. Okay. Back over to England again. Now we're going to talk about governments as institutions and how this started to reflect itself throughout Europe. So we have all these monarchies. We have these men who have ascended to power, and they're going to change government. In England, like I said, we're seeing increasing centralization. So in England, in 1154, we have the ascension to the throne of Henry II. He became king after a civil war that began when the English barons refused to be ruled by Henry I's daughter, Matilda. The House of Anjou, this is Henry II's family, struggled for power with the House of Blois from 1139 to 1153. Stephen of Blois was eventually forced to name Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, as his successor, and this began the Angevin dynasty. In 1152, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's very famous, a very strong woman. She was also formerly the wife of Louis VII of France. Eleanor actually brought heirs and territory to the marriage. She was powerful, she was independent-minded, but she lost much of her power to the domineering Henry. So Henry gained from this marriage while Eleanor lost. She later plotted with her eldest son to overthrow Henry, but the rebellion was put down. Henry II was determined to restore the power of the monarchy, and asserting control over the administration of justice was an important part of that project. He built on the existing Anglo-Saxon tradition of local courts, but added eyres, or judicial visits, from royal officials to localities. In this way, the Angevin kings made local affairs royal business and united the kingdom under a system of common law. And that common law has had a profound impact on the system of law in the United States as well. Common law offered new civil remedies for disputes, and the monarchy benefited from associated fines and fees. Conflict occurred over the jurisdiction of royal courts over churchmen, however, and this is not going to be an issue that's going to be resolved quickly. Henry's sons were Richard I, a couple of his most famous sons. Richard I, you would have known him as Richard the Lion-Hearted, and he reigned from 1189 to 1199. And then we have John, who reigned from 1199 to 1216. Now, these two sons further strengthened the financial condition of the monarchy, which grew really rich from court fees, royal estates, taxes, feudal dues, and such. However, both were really distracted by external affairs. In particular, Richard was often off crusading. Richard was actually captured in the Third Crusade and died protecting his continental possessions. Remember, these kings still have territories on the continent in France and other areas. John, as a monarch, was desperate for crown revenues to finance his struggle for continental territories as well. So both of these kings weren't necessarily concerned primarily with what was going on in England. in part, this helps to explain a barons' rebellion in 1215. The barons forced John to sign what we know of as the Magna Carta, and the Magna Carta defined the customary obligations of the nobility and obliged the king to uphold certain rights of his subjects. The Magna Carta implied that the king was not above the law and expanded the definition of freemen to include all subjects. So this is really remarkable because the barons were able to get these concessions from John. And if you've ever wondered what English genealogy looked like, this kind of gives you an idea of at least the genealogy of the Angevin families that came after William I, and how they're related exactly. Okay, now these are the graves of Eleanor and Henry, and I want you to take a look at it because I want you to think about how these graves, these are the coffin covers. You know, in Egypt, you would have called them the sarcophagi. So when you look at this, having just heard what you heard about Eleanor and Henry, how are these graves not reflective of the actual relationship between Eleanor and Henry? One of the most obvious things is that they're resting side by side, and they look peaceful, but in actuality we know that Eleanor actually bristled at the decrease in power she experienced after marrying Henry. She plotted against him and tried to sabotage his rule, and in turn Henry was a really dominating king and didn't maybe fully appreciate the strength of his wife, what she brought to the marriage. So for him, this was very much a political alliance. Now, why do you think medieval artists depicted the two royals in this way? So something to think about is that it's probably likely that an effort was being made to depict an image of stability within an unstable monarchy. So remember, their sons that ruled after Henry were often distracted by external affairs, and so there was probably a need to legitimize power, to assert an image of stability within the monarchy. And the placement of the tombs, which is actually in a rather powerful monastery, also emphasized the religious piety of the royals. Okay, and just another map that shows Europe. You could go back to the other slide that shows Europe previously and do some comparisons as to what is changing in these years. Another image, and so when you take a look at this, this is actually the murder of Thomas Becket, and you know, if you recall, Thomas Becket was murdered as a result of his conflicts with the monarchy over certain issues, and we will talk about that more. You can also check your book for the details on that. But it's really interesting that we have this image, and I want you to take a look at it, and I want you to think about the artist who is depicting this. Who do you think he is more sympathetic to? Which side do you think he is showing sympathy to in this issue? And so Thomas the Becket would be the figure in the middle who's kneeling at the altar. This implies, from the artist's point of view, that Becket was pious, and he's in a position of demonstrating piety. And we have the portrayal of the knights as really aggressive. They're coming into a church at a time when Thomas Becket is praying. They actually knock off Becket's hat, and they hurt his supporter. You can see the cleric to the right, and they hurt him. And this indicates that the artist appears to be more sympathetic to Becket. I think that's fairly obvious. You're free to disagree with me. And Becket came to be viewed as a martyr in England. Now, Becket's countenance is also pious and stalwart. It doesn't look like he is afraid. He looks like, he's been interrupted in this piety, in this expression of piety, but you don't get a sense that maybe he's afraid or that he's a coward or anything like that. But note the staff with the cross on top that he wields against the knights. Now in France, this development as government, as an institution, continues under the reign of the French monarch Philip. In 1180, at the age of 14, Philip the Augustus, who was the son of Louis VII, became King of France, even though Henry II of England controlled much of the territory of what would become modern France. And so this is going to set up a situation in which England and France are going to be in relatively constant conflict with one another over control of these territories. Henry and the Counts of Flanders and Champagne tried to control the young king, but Philip quickly learned to play the three rulers against each other and gained territory for the crown. He actually experienced victory over King John, remember, the son of Henry II, and he won a significant battle called Boussine in 1214, and this helped him to strengthen his grip on power and helped him to sort of establish his supremacy over the area of France. So this is really interesting because, one of the difficulties the French monarchs experienced is that we have this really dynamic situation in which the English king is actually technically a vassal of the French king, but in reality is a really strong monarch, and that English king would love nothing more than to take control of French areas as well, and in reality also controlled much of those French areas. And so you can see that these battles that Philip won over King John would have been significant. Philip used officers who followed many Norman customs, and he received a great deal of Norman support, interestingly enough. He introduced new efficient administrative practices in his kingdom, and he increased the use of written records. He made good use of the minor nobility in serving his court and as tax collectors. So again, he's kind of building this bureaucracy. Okay, and so this is just a map of the Kingdom of France and what it looks like, and you can see in light purple, you can see the area of Normandy that used to be controlled by the kings of England has now come under the control of Philip Augustus as a result of his conflict with King John. So on to Germany. Aristocratic families in the German Empire were strengthened by the weakening position of the emperor after the investiture conflict, and as we'll see in the lecture on the church, the investiture conflict was a conflict over who was going to appoint bishops, whether it was going to be the church or whether it was going to be a monarch. During that conflict, the Stauffer clan rallied support for the emperor, while the Hohenstaufens did the same for the papacy. So we have two really powerful families taking sides over this issue. And this involved both of them in a legendary struggle for power that extended beyond the 1122 Diet of Worms that was supposed to resolve the investiture conflict, but didn't really. Longing for peace, they agreed in 1152 to elect Frederick I emperor. He was a strong candidate with support from both families. Once in power, the bearded Frederick of Barbarossa was really impressive, and he was very firm. He was a very firm monarch. He strengthened the power of the emperor and succeeded in subordinating the princes. He saw his imperial office as sacred and sought to extend its rights. He actually married Beatrice of Burgundy. If you'll recall, Burgundy was a fief. It was a fiefdom of the French monarch. And that marriage to Beatrice strengthened him politically and territorially. Having gained control of Rome, Frederick sought more Italian territory. However, the emperor's control of Italy was largely nominal, with independent cities jealous of Rome's liberty and the Pope jealous of the emperor's authority. So we have a lot of jealousy going on here. By 1158, Frederick conquered northern Italy, but heavy-handed rule by German magistrates led cities to rebel and join with the Pope in the Lombard League by 1167. And so we're going to see this is a threat to Frederick's power and control in these areas. The League defeated Frederick at the Battle of Legano in 1176 and pushed Frederick out of most of Italy. Frederick's dependency on older systems of personal loyalty and vassalage had internal consequences in Germany as well, where Henry the Lion, he was the Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, grew so powerful and wealthy that he came into conflict with Frederick, whose authority he refused to recognize. By 1180, Henry had been driven out of Germany and his estates were confiscated. To accomplish this, Frederick had to grant additional power and influence to the princes who supported him and divided Henry's lands among all of them rather than keeping them for himself. So you can see that this has some significance for Frederick in that he could not have accomplished this without the support of the princes. And this creates obligations. Now, we do have some regions where rulers failed to establish effective bureaucratic institutions, and they struggled to hold together as a result. In Hungary, we have a king named Bela III, who built up a large and powerful state, but after his death, his failure to establish effective institutions led to the splintering of his kingdom. Similarly, in Rus, which was the nascent Muscovite state, this kingdom built on the accomplishments of the Rus at Kiev, but crumbled as rival claimants fought for power and control. While Western rule became more bureaucratic, Byzantine rule became increasingly personal during the last half of the 12th century. The Fourth Crusade sacking of Constantinople in 1204 weakened the state considerably. Although they retook Constantinople from its Crusader-appointed emperor in 1261, the empire never recovered. All right, so one last map as we end this particular lecture, and then I want you to go ahead and make sure that you've watched the lecture on church power as well, because these two institutions, church and kingdoms, are developing alongside one another and have the strengthening of these institutions has repercussions, long-reaching repercussions. So this is one last map that just gives you an idea of what is going on in the eastern part of the Western world. So a lot of this is what we know of today is Eastern Europe, going up into Russia, and then including what used to be, at this time it's no longer Greece. Greece is part of the Byzantine Empire, as is Turkey and some of these other areas, and you'll see that in green.